Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. Climate change, war, the pandemic, and a dangerously fragile financial system. Our world continues to confront a multitude of challenges that we predicted would happen but failed to prevent. So why do we refuse to learn from history in our attempts to make a better world? Looking at trade, currency, equities, employment and debt, prolific economic commentator and historian Adam Tooze provides a unique viewpoint on the world we're living in. Join Adam as he makes sense of knowledge and power throughout time with his 2022 FODI talk, F equals fail.
Hi everyone, it's a real pleasure to be here and thank you all for coming out. I was given this incredibly challenging prompt today. F equals fail, what a title. If we have failed to learn from history in our attempt to make a better world, can we retake the test? And then on from there into the second part of the blurb, the 21st century was supposed to be better than this. As we confront the impacts of climate change, you can see I'm reading from this slide in front of me here. Wars old and new, the pandemic and its aftermath, and a dangerously fragile global financial system. It's time to ask, why can't we get our acts together and solve the issues that matter? Now, I'm sure everyone in this room this afternoon has felt exactly these emotions and asked themselves these questions. And I want really in the next half hour or so to wrestle with them, to roll them round and round in our minds. I mean, the more I thought about the somewhat circuitous talk that I wrote for today, the more it feels like really a kind of journey down a rabbit hole. And I'm going to twist these questions around over and over again. I'm not sure really where I come out, and you'll see that. But I think the process of going through this chain of reasoning is worthwhile because it, I think, is part of the answer to these questions that haunt us, that nag at us, as they must. Because there's a sort of paradox at the heart of this, and I want to start really by laying out sort of three fundamental answers to the question, like why can't we get our act together to solve the big issues? Why can't we do that? What is the problem? Why can't we learn from history? Well, let's actually try and answer that question. If we do, if the slides will allow me to move, there's something inherently paradoxical about this proposal, and it goes to the depths, really, of what we mean by history and how we came to think about what history is, because our modern notion of history emerges precisely from the consciousness in the West, and people like Reinhard Koselleck, the great German philosopher of history, date this to what he calls the saddle period between the late 18th and the early 19th century, the realization in the wake, if you like, of the French Revolution and the industrial revolutions of that epoch, that the present may be radically different from the past. We are liberated, as a result, from cyclical notions of time and history, like those imposed upon much of humanity by the agricultural cycle, or, on the other hand, the eschatological notions of time offered by Christianity in particular. We're liberated into a history that is free, that is moving, that is dynamic, that is open-ended, but also radically different from the past. And if it's the difference between the past and the present that opens up the space of history, then learning from history is going to be an inherently doomed exercise from the very beginning, because what the future will hold as what the present holds in relation to the past is radical difference. It's going to be fundamentally difficult to decide, in fact, what just happened. And that's not, as it were, a failure of our intellect. I would argue that it is inherently built into, deeply rooted, architected into what moderns have understood history to be from the very beginning. It's not for nothing that since the late 19th century, as my brilliant colleague Holly Case has laid out in this extraordinary book, which I commend to you this afternoon, The Age of Questions, it's not for nothing that since the late 19th century, Western humanity, European and the United States at least, has been dominated by what we think of as a series of questions: the problem of X, the woman question, the race question, the social question, the economic question. All of these are ways in which our societies have problematized this experience, that the present is radically different from the past, and so the question of what to do next is opened up, and it becomes a question. So this question that we're asking ourselves this afternoon is not new to us at this particular moment, but one that has haunted successive generations of people living with this Western modern concept of history for now well on 200 years. Why can't we get our acts together and solve the issues that matter is a typically impatient modern question. It is not a question that is new in that sense, though of course, as I'll say, it acquires a radical actuality. But how can we learn from the past, in other words, if we are constantly facing change? And think about these in modern terms. What about the early experience of industrialization would be useful to us at a moment like the one that we're currently at? What lessons would we want to learn from the 1850s or even the 1950s about a world transformed by this kind of level of CO2 emissions? There is here, I would argue, a fundamental paradox at work. A desire to work from history, the sense that we can go nowhere else for inspiration but to our past experience, but the experience itself suggests that we may not in fact be able to draw any serious inferences. This is the issue of tipping points, the fundamentally oppressive sense that we live under in the current moment, that we are years, weeks, possibly hours away from some transformative event that is going to change the world, like the pandemic did to us in a matter of days in early 2020. The second problem is what I would refer to as the problem of the radical future. If the present is different from the past, then the one thing that we know about the future is that it will be different from the present. That is the only thing we can confidently say about it if we are caught up in this kind of transformative process. And what if our models tell us, our best efforts to predict that future is going to be radically different from the present? Not slightly different, but radically different from the present. Are we capable of crafting a politics that is able to deal seriously with the implications of where we're going to be on this same graph? This graph is going to recur again and again and again in this afternoon's talks for obvious reasons. What would it actually mean to craft a politics which addressed the radical novelty which our best guess suggests the future holds in store for us? It's not obvious to me that we have any good answers to that question. We have an irreducible, it seems to me, attachment to the status quo, and it's a very tall order indeed to demand of politics that it insists on radical change now for the sake of a future which we are going to claim is going to be totally different from the present on the basis of our assumption and our experience that futures do tend to be different from the present. But how do you in fact craft and found a politics on the basis of that? Can we prepare ourselves for futures which are radically different? Think about what we have experienced most recently with regard to COVID. We knew it was coming, and yet even when it was upon us, we failed to respond to it. We could entrust this task to experts. It could be their job to prepare endlessly for this future that will be radically different. But we know it's an incredibly oppressive burden. It destabilizes your sense of normality. It tends towards the apocalyptic. It tends towards almost a fantastical notion of the future. How do we shock ourselves into the realization that there is no planet B, that there is no second chance, that this is not a drill, but this is reality? These are not easy things to do, and perhaps therefore we need to be kinder with ourselves when we face the reality of failure in this regard. There was literally nothing about the COVID shock which should have surprised us. Literally everything about that was predicted, was forecasted, was prepped for. It took us by surprise in the sense that it swept through the richest countries of the world, whereas many epidemiological experts predicted that it would hit the poorest countries first. But nevertheless, there was nothing about this disaster which really, in truth, should have surprised us. And yet, even when we were facing the reality, it was incredibly difficult to switch into the mood and the mode which said, now it's for real. what we would have needed to have done in early February 2020 is to have shut down every major airport in the world. And if anyone had suggested that at the time, they would have been laughed out of the room. And then there is the third question, what I'm going to call problem number 3, which is who is we? In this statement, why can't we get our act together and solve the issues that matter? Who is the we? That, I think, is the third political question. If the first have about them the ring, if you like, almost of questions of, well, they're either metaphysical questions about the nature of time and the relationship of the past, the present, and the future, or they're issues which are not exactly to do with perhaps human nature, but they're behavioral, they're issues of cognitive capacity. They're issues of political discourse and our ability to encompass the future. This one is the fundamental political economic question. Who is the we that we are appealing to when we make this demand, why can't we prepare better? After all, one person's unsolved issue is another person's business opportunity. One of the fundamental answers to this question of why we can't get our act together to address the future is something like this. It is the fact that coal is still big business, or at least on one vision of the world that it is. It pitches one group of people against another, one class against another, one interest against another, and that is obviously at the root of our inability to concert our actions. If these were purely economic clashes, you might say, well, okay, we can arbitrate them, because for any purely economic clash, there would be a deal that could be made. Essentially, some sort of redistributive deal could be made. It's how, for instance, slavery was ended in the British Empire, by means of compensation, believe it or not, for the slaveholders to satisfy the demands for a just and moral order being articulated by the abolitionists. So that is one level of problem, and if you can move it to there, then you actually have a solvable problem, even in the event of fundamental clashes. But conflicts in historical reality are rarely purely anything. They are almost always an overlaying mesh of interests, identities, and conflicting visions of the future, so nicely illustrated in your own parliament not too long ago. That hunk of coal stands for more than just the vested interests of mining businesses and workers. It stands for a particular vision of what Australia is, and we see that gesture repeated over and over again by the Poles in Europe, for instance, who wave lumps of coal in a very similar way, or by petrol interests and extractivist interests in the Americas, where oil is nothing less than God's blessing on and demonstration of manifest destiny. So there are conflicting interests, and these interests are loaded up with far more than simply naked economic interests. They are loaded up with ideas about identity and culture. And even in the case where there are positive sum outcomes that we could be talking about, so set aside the distributional issue, figure out ways of brokering deals that would tie people together. Even if we are able to do that, the narrowness of vision and short-sightedness means that it's quite possible that we'll end up on the red lines rather than the blue lines. It's quite, I think now, within the technocratic planning bodies of the world, well established that there are win-win strategies for decarbonization. The blue lines here, this is the Bank of International Settlements, offering to its audience of financial experts 2 visions of global decarbonization. And the difference between these 2 paths, which are, as you can see here, in the order of 10% of global GDP. So we're talking about tens of trillions of dollars that are at stake here. The difference between those 2 lines is literally the question of whether or not we can concert short-run investments and medium-term investments towards longer-term goals. And even if the prospect is of tens of trillions of dollars of saving one way or another, no one in their right mind is confident that we can find ourselves on those blue rather than those red lines. It may be true, therefore, and many of us were quoting John Maynard Keynes in 2020 and the years that followed, it may be true, as he said in 1943, that anything we can actually do, we can afford. The problem is actually concerting ourselves, getting our act together to do the things that we need to do. This is the profound challenge, and that profound challenge is obviously politics or political economy in the most general sense. So if you wanted to give, as it were, a three-phase answer to this question of why we can't get our act together to solve the big issues, you would start by saying, well, learning from history is hard because it's contradictory. Facing the future, if it's truly radical, is difficult because who could make that leap of imagination and take people with them? And third, could we constitute the we that would enable us to do this? This, as it were, the starting point for my argument this afternoon. Now, you could answer by saying, well, fine, okay, politics is the issue. Let's take politics out of the equation. Let's hand these questions off to a group of experts with the courage of their own convictions, experts who would be willing to say at the moment of crisis, this is not a drill, this is the moment to act, we must act now. But the question, of course, is, would we agree with their diagnosis? We might be able to solve problem 2, because presumably these experts would be willing to believe their predictions and say, right, we must now act. But would we actually agree with their diagnosis? Problem number 1, would we actually find their understanding and their extrapolations from the past to the future convincing? And this illustration here is of central banking elite, and that right now is a question facing them, including the Central Bank of Australia, which is now conducting a searching review of its own failure to predict, anticipate, act on the basis of past evidence to try and stop the surge of price inflation that we have seen, not just here, of course, but around the world. So even if we were able to solve problem 2 by constituting a group of experts who could simply make the call, in other words, voiding the problem of politics, we would face the issue of whether we could actually trust them to draw the right inferences from the past. And if we did put technocrats in charge, what about problem 3? What about the question of the we? Whose interests would that group actually be serving? In fact, who would the technocrats be? Where would we choose them from? Would it be people like us in this room here or some other self-selecting elite that would make this choice? And in any case, central bankers are technocrats, but how much freedom of action do they actually have? And this illustration from one of the most well-known books about 2008 is rather nice, because you can see, as it were, the government building at the top there, balancing on too big to fail. Who in the management of financial crises is actually calling the shots? Are the interventions by central banks in 2008 or 2020, for that matter, acts of sovereignty in the Schmittian sense, elites declaring an emergency and declaring that whatever it takes now prevails, or is it in fact the financial interests which are doing that job? For them really to have free rein, for those elites really to have free rein, we would need them to be acting in a vacuum of social power. We would need them to be free to enact, as it were, the technocratic logic, the derivations of the present and the future from the past that we want to see them doing. That would require a re-engineering of the social interests and the political system to create space. We would actually need technocracy, not just the situation in which some people with expertise govern, but one in which they were governing a society which they had a prospect of controlling. So if we really wanted to get our act together to solve collective issues, we would start by re-engineering society so as to be able to ensure that history took a logical course and that we were therefore able to direct it intelligently. And this is one of those moments where I want to turn you around for a second, because that is, of course, the agenda of revolutionary politics as classically formulated in the European tradition in the 19th century. We find ourselves in pursuit of this solutionist question this afternoon, echoing the opinions of somebody writing like this. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. And at that point, societies look for solutions to those problems, and no problem is posed for which the resources of social resolution are not available. And we come down to the very end, where at this moment we are on the cusp of leaving historical constraints behind, and the promise is opened up. The prehistory of human society accordingly closes with this social formation. And ladies and gentlemen, obviously you know who we're talking about here. This is Karl Marx in London in 1859, wondering why can't we get our act together to solve the major issues, and hoping for the best. Because he is saying, damn it, I'm tired of history. History is conflict. History is contradiction. History is this thing I'm going to have to write Das Kapital 1, 2, and 3 to understand its perverse and twisted logic. If only we could get out of history, or what he's describing here is prehistory. In other words, the passage of events under the logic of contradiction, not of actual purposive guidance. If and when we can escape that logic, we will arrive at the moment at which we can in fact direct this in an intelligent way, and our collective understanding and our collective humanity will be what is calling the shots. But what does history tell us about the success of this kind of effort to end prehistory and escape into a zone of conscious control? Well, it depends who you ask, right? This is history problem 1 or history problem 3, perhaps. Depends who you ask. Friedrich Hayek thought he had the answer to this. From history, and predictively, what would happen if you put a technocratic group in charge of the point of the job of planning history? And these are from the Reader's Digest illustrated guide to the Road to Serfdom. They're really rather fantastic. Well, you'd have a plan, and then you'd need a man who can make a plan work, and then he would show up and he'd look an awful lot like Goering, and then the absolutely worst thing happens. They smash your golf clubs and make you do calisthenics. I kid you not. This is literally the denouement of the Road to Serfdom, according to the Reader's Digest in 1947, paid for by General Motors. Literally, they smash your golf clubs and make you do aerobics. That is where history teaches you, according to this liberal reading of history, this thought process of ours, which led us to the conclusion that we could have empowered technocrats if and only if we changed society such that the problem 3 was eliminated. This is where it would lead you. And of course, that story goes on. That story goes to 1989, and it doesn't stop. It continues all the way down to the present day, literally in the last few weeks, the taking down of the last Soviet monuments across the Baltic over this summer. That's where that train, that thought process ends you up. But does it? Twist ourselves around again. Does it? Is this actually the most important thing that happened in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall? Is that the most important thing that happened, or is this Tiananmen Square that summer? And for many people, until really quite recently, for many people, if you were looking for a society which had created the conditions under which an empowered technocratic elite could get its act together so as to address the major issues of the day, it would, of course, been China. And as I say that, there's a sort of uncomfortable sense in the room, oh my God, what is Tooze doing? But this was Xi Jinping at Davos in 2017, where he was hailed precisely as the man who could anchor the major issues of the day and the future of globalization against the insanity of the Trump administration in the United States. But this is, as you already know and already sense, where history continues to play tricks on us, because in 2022, standing here today with you in Sydney talking about this issue, how do we actually feel about the Chinese success story and the triumphant ability of their technocrats to get their act together and to concert the solution of the major issues outstanding? What does China actually exhibit in, for instance, the struggle with COVID? The triumph of zero COVID in 2020 for sure, the failure of their public health early warning system at the beginning of that year, followed by lockdown. But now, 2 years on from that, problem number 1 is really, really kicking us in the butt here. Learning from history with regard to China at this stage is really quite difficult to do, because what's been exposed is their extraordinary failure to get 3 of their own vaccines into the arm of the most vulnerable members of their elderly population. Not something I think the vast majority of people would have predicted about Beijing's performance in this epidemic. In fact, both within China's regime itself, I would submit, though it's very difficult to say this from the outside, but one has to imagine that inside the regime they are asking themselves exactly the same questions as we are. But certainly from the outside, we're struggling with problems 1, 2, and 3 with regard to our interpretation of China at this moment. The West didn't see Xi's authoritarian turn coming, problem number 1. We were unable to extrapolate from the past effectively to the present and the future. When Xi came in, many of you will remember in 2012, he was widely seen as a reforming liberalizer. Go back, read the newspapers, it's an extraordinary thing. Problem number 2, even in the face of the emerging antagonism, an active and serious war, in fact to the point of banalization, a discussion of the possibility of a major war between the United States and China over Taiwan, we still stare at this in disbelief and simply cannot believe the evidence before our eyes of the possibility of an uncoupling of the Chinese economy from the capitalist West. This is a thought simply too difficult to contemplate. Large numbers of actors in the financial markets right now struggle to decide whether or not this is priced in. So there is in fact a meta-discourse right now in financial markets about the question of whether or not a future in which China is uncoupled from the West can actually already be priced. And thirdly, of course, we are dealing with vested interests which, in regard to this problem, are absolutely massive. Huge investments by manufacturing, industrial interests, raw material exporters like from this country, or financial interests in the United States. This question of, as it were, learning from history to find some way of gauging where we should stand in relation to China is as fraught as any problem of this type we've ever faced. It is a profound conundrum, and I think we should be, to that extent, as it were, not forgiving of our inability to read this, but certainly when you break it down like this, it's easy enough, I think, to see why it is so difficult for us to make this call. One difference, however, is for absolute certain. In the capitalist West and much of the other post-colonial world of the rest of the world, notably and most importantly India in this context, there was no wholesale social revolution, there was no cultural revolution to snap and to break the legacies of traditional culture, of religion, and of traditional politics. So the we that we can call upon everywhere else in the world, the we that we invoke when we say, get your act together, you there, is much more fractured, is diverse, antagonistic, and unequal in a way that is markedly different from that which faces the regime in Beijing. Think about the Quad. Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, the latest we trying to get its act together to face the big issues of the day. Think about them. They're all four democracies, so to that extent they use competitive elections to constitute a we, but they are radically different types of democracies. And if you think about the Indian one, the BJP, arguably the most dramatically successful political party, democratic political party, perhaps ever in history, what kind of a formation is it? It's a liberal, it's Hindu nationalist, and it governs by a souped-up and rather remarkable form of techno-populism, which now allows the Indian administration to hand out cash benefits to an extraordinarily large population. It is also, however, closely affiliated with the paramilitary RSS. So a very peculiar kind of we that we're talking about there, this Quad formation. Membership in the Quad does not bind India into a common front versus Russia over Ukraine, for instance. On the other hand, despite its emphasis on Hindu culture and Hindu nationalism and the distinctiveness and the separateness of that tradition, Modi at Glasgow at COP26 actually came round to signing up India to net zero by 2070. A remarkable kind of combination, if you like, of distinctive, separate interests pursued ruthlessly in a policy of pragmatism on the one hand, and on the other hand, a strange subordination of a state which, after all, would have every interest in the world and the cultural politics to back it up, to simply engage in flat-out, full-on climate denialism, nevertheless signing up to some sort of at least consensus on the rhetorical level to the common goal of climate neutrality by 2070. It's one of the more remarkable features of global policy discourse around the climate, in fact, that it has been possible through the relatively soft power of science to constitute a we which recognizes its interest in as carbon stabilization, and that two states, both China and India, which you might think would have every interest in the world in engaging in flat-out climate denialism, have not done so. What I'm trying to do in this later stages of today's talk is to map for you, as it were, the grey zones of cooperation, dissensus, which open up before us at this moment. Meanwhile, in the United States, we see a massive commitment to defense spending. So the United States can constitute can create a concerted cross-party alliance, a bipartisan commitment on the American side to military spending. Even America's polity, as fissured as it is, as much as there is talk of civil war, can nevertheless rally around defense spending. And on the other hand, it can only barely just by the thinnest of possible margins, by the skin of its teeth, and at the last possible moment, pass what is, for the Americans, the largest piece of climate legislation in its history, but only just. That the constitution of a viable body to act on this issue on climate is in the United States incredibly fragile, but it happened. And this, as it were, the tenor of what I want to finish by saying in this talk this afternoon. But it did happen. How did it happen? What was it that allowed the Americans to, at the last minute, pull together this extraordinarily surprising deal, anchored by Joe Manchin, of all people, around large-scale subsidies for decarbonization? Well, on the one hand, it was, in fact, an instance of learning from history. If you look inside the politics of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the weird moniker they've given to the climate package, it's all about learning from the past. This is an example of the American climate community learning very actively from past experiences. It is all carrots, no sticks, no effort at carbon pricing, no effort at carbon taxation, it's all subsidy. It is also learning in a conservative sense. All of the social ambition of the Green New Deal out the window, replaced by fiscal conservatism, the promise to limit the deficit and cut inflation. It echoes Make America Great Again in its nationalist industrial rhetoric. And it is essentially premised on the predicting into the future the progress that has currently been made over the last 10 to 20 years in the cost curves for decarbonization and renewable energy. So in all of these senses, it is an example of extrapolating from past experience relatively effectively in an ad hoc way to craft a political deal that is possible. It is, however, fundamentally, and this is what I would really argue, the discovery of a shifting balance of power. In other words, we were able to move forward on this because the forces that I've bracketed under problem 3, in other words, the constitution of the constitution of a powerful social force that will, in fact, enable you to learn from history and not fight against it, was viable in America at this point. That is the result of lobbying, of tireless work on the part of climate activists, but it is also part of the shifting balance, the shifting tides of American capitalism. America suddenly discovered that there is a green capitalist lobby, even in the United States, like there is, of course, and has been for some time in Europe, that was willing to come behind. Companies like Duke Energy, for instance, lobbied hard for this package to pass. So this analytic that we have, the difficulty of learning from the past, the difficulty of accepting a radical future, the difficulty of building a social coalition that will enable you to do that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a roadblock, but under certain conditions, it can become the basis on which you can actually construct the possibility for change. And in the twisted, somewhat perverse way in which the Inflation Reduction Act finally got passed, we see a constructive example of that being done, but of course at the price of losing all of its radical energy. A fundamentally conservative repackaging has enabled this to go through. In a limited way, therefore, you could say that we are getting our act together. Once upon a time, you would have shrugged and said, well, you know, it's a terrible way to proceed, except for all the alternatives, that kind of common liberal wisdom, and that would have passed for, as it were, an adequate assessment. The question, of course, is whether, faced with the onrush of climate change, whether we can really afford that kind of half measure. That, I think, is the fundamental reason why we keep agonizing over this. We know we can make steps. Even in the United States, steps on climate policy are possible. But are they enough? Not in the sense of do they move us in the right direction, but do they move us at the pace that our diagnosis of history actually tells us we need to go? Are we meeting the challenge of the future? Are we meeting and offering adequate answers to that second question of the radicalism of the future? If this is our past, can we afford to repeat it? What this graph shows is the impact on the world economy of COVID. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the most dramatic graph I'm showing you this afternoon, because nothing like this has ever previously happened in human experience. This is the big kahuna. This is the whole thing. This is the whole enchilada. This is the world economy, $180 trillion of it, contracting by 20%. In the space not of years or months, but weeks in early 2020. Humanity has never experienced a shock like this. This is the reflection of rates of unemployment in India and China of over 20%, of the total shutdown of large parts of the world economy. The question we're asking here, are we able to get our act together, cannot any longer satisfactorily be answered with the platitudes of a liberal past that said, well, we will somehow get our way there, but, well, fast enough at this pace. And it's that tension, I think, that ultimately eats away at us and forces this question. And yet, we have no alternative answer, because how did we escape from the COVID crisis? How did we escape from it? Well, we escaped from it through the Hail Mary of the vaccine program, the extraordinarily accelerated vaccine development of Operation Warp Speed, an unprecedentedly fast-paced development of vaccines for a set of diseases for which we had never previously had a solution. I vividly remember sitting in Columbia University in 2020 and being told by an eminent colleague from STEM, Adam, look, we've never had a coronavirus vaccine. We do not know how to do this, and yet we did develop one, and then what did we do? We vaccinated 2/3 of the global population and not the other third. I have 4 vaccines in my arm at this point, and more than 20% of the world's population have none whatsoever. Is this what our future looks like? Not the technocratic self-confidence of adopting known solutions to well-documented issues, not the complacent promise that the market will solve it, nor, however, the braggadocio of JFK and moonshots, right? And nor the desperation of a Stalin who says we must industrialize, otherwise they'll bury us. What we are going to do, apparently, is we're going to slouch. We're going to slouch into the future, right? That appears to be what we are up against. We're going to slouch. And as soon as you say slouch nowadays, right, you can't help but think of Yeats, right? You think of the great poem 1919, The Second Coming, and these immortal lines, right? Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And these are the crucial lines. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The combination of this sense of, as it were, a monster slouching onto the scene and the promise of an escape, right? And the promise of a second coming of an escape. And think about the great modernists who have taken up this slouching metaphor to, on the one hand, write the history of post-colonial Africa in Achebe's great novel, and on the other hand, Joan Didion and her shocking account of Berkeley and the San Francisco counterculture in 1967, which ends of an image, if you may remember this extraordinary essay, of, I think, a preschool child at the age of 4 being dosed up with acid for the purposes of childcare, a kind of savage vision of where we're going to end up. And yet, we're still here, right? And yet, this is California's reality today. 50 years on from Joan Didion's moment, one of the richest places in the entire world, the generator of the tech revolution, on the other hand, a place of this extraordinary and epic homelessness. But continuing on, in Nigeria, well, through trauma, through civil war, through the disastrous failure of economic development, too, and this is this sort of duality that we struggle with, the largest demographic boom on the planet, a country which will overtake the United States in population by the 2030s and will become the greatest driver of human expansion in the coming century if disasters do not intervene. This, I think, this reality that we have to encompass and we have to measure our impatience against. So if I have a dangerous idea this afternoon, and I'm not sure I do, but if this might be a dangerous idea, let us become conscious of the impatience, the sort of almost schoolmasterly or schoolmarmly impetus that runs through my prompt. F for fail. We failed to learn from history in our attempts to make a better world. Can we retake the test? Right? This impulsive, demanding, censorious measure of timeless measure. Can we go back in time? It seems to me to be out of kilter with the reality of the texts of modernity, which have wrestled repeatedly with this question, which have foretold disaster and promised resolution, promised hope, and yet have ridden on top of a process of change which has continued, in a sense, almost regardless of that, right? If you look at global GDP, if you look at global population, if you look at the emissions of CO2, this churning conversation about what we might do differently and how we might do better seems almost like epiphenomenal to that dynamic that sits in the background. We may not be able to get our acts together, but what it does seem reasonable to suggest is that we will have makeshifts, we will look for compromises, we will find hustles, we'll defer, we'll react, we'll adapt, we'll crisis fight, we'll ameliorate, and we will slouch, not towards utopia or disaster, it seems to me, but potentially, possibly towards coping. The central question, and the central question that I think we need to focus on, is this issue of timing. Is it going to be enough? Is it going to be fast enough? Is it going to be, for some reason, I think it's not allowing me to do my final slide because I'm over time. Will it be large enough? Will it be fast enough? Will we be able to keep up with, pace with this reality that we face and that preoccupies and concerns us all so much? Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
This session was recorded live at Carriageworks Sydney. The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.